So, good afternoon. A very good afternoon to all of you. Today we have our honorable keynote speaker, Dr. Jainjak Shumakar, architect Rahul Singhi, director Poornima Group, Dr. Dinesh Goyal, principal and director of Poornima Institute of Engineering Technology, and all my dear participants. I, Dr. Pran Dadij, head of Civil Engineering Department, warmly welcome you all in this current session of webinar on smart urban transportation system. I feel proud to introduce Dr. Jainjak Shumakar, Associate Professor in the Department of Urban Management at Kyoto University, Kyoto, Japan. Dr. Schumacher completed his PhD from Imperial College of London, and his first area of research is modeling of passenger behavior in networks, including aspects such as fare structure, crowding, bunching, and real-time information. Dr. Schumacher's current research interest area further look at long-term demand adaptation to transport infrastructure investments, technological advances, and trends such as shared mobility. He has vast experience in teaching, and he has published many research papers during his teaching and research career. So he has more than 80 international peer-reviewed journal publications, and he has also book uh, book published, and or as well as 16 book chapters he has published during his this experience. And he is not only in research, he is also have guided many students in for the doctoral degree. More than 15 students guided as a doctoral degree courses as well as master courses. He is also founding member and secretary in various conference scientific committees. He has published many papers in various conferences, and instead of that, he also won many awards as outstanding paper, best paper, etc. So I warmly welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Schumacher, in this webinar, and I will request him to please start his session on smart mobility and estimating irregular trips. Sensei, please start. So please unmute microphone, Sensei. Sensei, please unmute your microphone.
Good afternoon. Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes, Sensei.
Yes. Well, yeah, so Dr. Pran, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm very glad I have this chance actually to present to you presenting here a German from Japan to Jaipur. I should maybe say I know Dr. Pran from our time at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, where we overlapped, where I was working for a while, and here as well. Thank you also to the other faculty for making this feasible, and yeah, welcome very much to all the audience, and I'm very glad to have this presentation now. So giving a keynote speech or giving a speech as audience, there's always, I find always the problem, do I go too much into detail or am I too broad? If I'm too broad, it's easy boring for those of you who have a lot of expertise in the area. If I'm too specific, I might lose a big proportion of the audience who's not interested in that specific part. So I'm trying to find a middle way here. And I guess the first parts of this talk are more general, and then I put in at some point some of my specific research results. Maybe for some of you it will not be enough detail, but feel very welcome to then also ask me questions on more specifics that I in various parts that I do admit. Okay, that kind of is my introduction. So the title I chose for today is, as it says here, New Data Sources, Smart Mobility and Estimating Irregular Trips. This title comes from, actually a number of my research interests. Recently, really the idea of big data, artificial intelligence, of course, were India is at the forefront in many of these aspects, and how they influence transport, specifically public transport. And I want to make the point, I guess one of the points I want to make in this presentation is that that especially the, well, normal demand patterns, if we think about how many people commute to work, how many people go shopping, if we think about residents, for those we have a lot of data. We have surveys. We know that we know that quite well. But especially we need data for these irregular trips. And being in Kyoto, a big part of transport in this city is tourism. And estimating tourism trips is traditionally very difficult. To survey them, to understand trips, to understand how they travel, because these are very irregular trips. I want to make these links, especially for this new data source of smart mobility and these irregular trips. Okay, because this slide is an introduction. You can see my presentation well, or? Yeah? You can see my presentation well, or?
Yes, yes,
I
sir.
hope so. Okay, if there's any problem, let me know, yeah.
No, it's visible, sensor.
Okay, good. Okay. So this just as this is one of the, well, it's a little bit outdated now, but from our homepage, big data for public transport planning. So yeah, I'm in the ITS lab, Intelligent Transportation System, but I sometimes also call it Information, Transit, and Society. So we specifically focus on public transport modeling. And the slogan here, you can kind of see here, creating intelligent and smart transport supported by IT systems, supported by information technology to enhance the attractiveness of urban areas. Okay, so what I want to, so a bit more detail, what I want to do in this talk is, there's basically three areas. The first one is transport innovations and big data. And this is, I do this quite fast, this first part. And then I want to more specifically talk about shared mobility. And I think it's very important. We talk a lot about shared mobility, but I think it's very important to bring some order into this discussion. And since there are so many different forms of shared mobility, including in India, I think. I want to bring some order in there. What systems, I mean, we should actually distinguish, and that different types of shared mobility actually have very different pros and cons. Ourselves, we did quite a bit of research on Harmo. This is one car sharing system, and I will talk a bit about that. So that's where it starts to become more specific. And then the third part is about Kyoto, and I think this links quite well to the first part. Yeah? So we use here big data for demand estimation of these irregular trips. So the second part is kind of in between, but the one point I'm making is that big data actually trigger shared mobility. So there's also a strong link between those two. Okay. So first part, transport innovations and big data. I mean, if you listen to any transport, if you go to any transport related conference now, there are so many keywords that occur occur all the time, that if you ask to submit papers to conferences, these are usually the keywords that people ask for. Right? So on demand, yeah, on demand transport. We're away from static transport. We're away from timetable buses to now services coming on demand. Integrated. Yep, we're looking at services between intermodal integration, shared transport, and I come to that. Electrification of the transport, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, and so on, so on. So these three pictures here, just to I think illustrate these ideas. You have here the shared electric vehicle, and you have here the competition of traditional taxis with Uber-like systems. And there again, the mobile phone being one of the key elements for it. And then bicycle sharing, so also trying to introduce sustainable shared modes that help solve transportation problems. But it becomes really interesting if we combine those elements. Yeah? Just shared vehicles will not be such a game changer. But if you have autonomous shared vehicles, well, then already we can think about system benefits in terms of how these vehicles might reduce vehicle mileage driven. And if they are connected, then we can introduce also intelligent traffic management systems for these vehicles. If they're just autonomous, I'm not convinced that they will actually lead to a better transportation system. So the first point here is this is for private vehicles, and the same for public transport. The keyword here that is now used everywhere is mobility as a service. And again, what is mobility as a service? It's just an integration of those keywords that I mentioned on the previous slide. It's on-demand service, in most cases including some kind of shared systems, and system integration of, well, in this case, often the payment system being integrated. We all know about big data and AI, and the main point I want to make here is that it's both. It's trigger and effect. Only because we have big data, only we have all this information available, only therefore we can have these combinations. Usually we think about it the other way around. Because we have these transportation systems, therefore we have the big data. But I think it's very important to actually see it's going both ways around. The big data, I think the trigger is actually coming first, and only then the effect. So what data do we have if we talk about big data and transportation? Well, there is foremost, of course, our mobile phones, and these mobile phones give us so much information. Location records, we have through various apps that we can have these that we can install and through which we can collect information about travel patterns, searches that people make, inquiries, timetable planning that people do, with all kind of information that we can get. Okay, this is, I think, internet logs, tweets on accidents, again, searches on what people do, cameras, crowding, speeds, incidents, all kind of other sensors, on vehicle sensors, on road sensors. If we think about public transport context at stops, very important. Payment points, if you think about electronic toll collection systems, smart ticketing, online bookings. Then there is a whole world of Internet of Things, vehicle-to-vehicle communication, vehicle-to-infrastructure communication, vehicle-to-anything communication. Okay, all of these you could make make a separate talk about. But I think the main point is that we have this vast amount of data that trigger new transport options. Specifically about public transport, if you think here where we have the big data, we can and try to distinguish here by different journey stages. Firstly, we often want to know where people board, and where people board is different from people's origin. So access tracking via some kind of mobile phone application. Most cases. Sensors at and around stops then often tell us, for example, how long is a person waiting at the stop? How long is the queue? Which person is waiting how long for a bus? We're experimenting with Wi-Fi sensors. I come to that in a moment. Then people actually the transfer in between. And often transfer information is actually quite difficult to get. If you think about metro systems, it's often, we're talking about mobility as a service, about seamless transport, so that actually you don't want to give any physical tap in, tap out, so that but it can be seamless. But on the other side, we do have payment systems, and the payment systems sometimes give us information about transfer points, not always. Then we have onboard sensors telling us crowding on the vehicles, telling us how many seats are left, for example. Also telling us information from public transport on other modes, or vice versa. And then finally, egress tracking, where we also want to understand, again, possibly through mobile phone applications. Okay, this is just to give you some idea of this is not the main topic of today, on research we are doing with smart card data. This is the book that Fran mentioned, edited together with a colleague. And so just to give you here some clues of what I mean with the possibilities of public transport data, so in this case, specifically smart card data, well, home to bus stop distance events. How many people do we lose as customers for if with distance from the home to the bus stop? X meter more to the bus stop means Y percentage of passengers lost. Timetable changes in bus choice. So this is a study we did in a Japanese city. If you change the timetable just a little bit, okay, you lose some customers because they can't get a good connection anymore. We could also use these smart cards for intelligent systems like here, urban mileage system, to think about, okay, give people points or credit points for traveling by public transport. So this Lulu car that you see here a picture of, it's a private company in Japan that owns a lot of shopping facilities as well as public transport facilities. So by using the Lulu car for public transport, you can get discounts in shopping markets. Okay. Life quality of older people. This is a study we did again with smart card data, where we can understand, but where we, in this case, where we combined the smart card data with a survey to that gives us information on the survey recorded. We asked people there about the satisfaction with different activities they are doing, and in general their satisfaction with their mobility possibilities. Long-term changes in behavior. By now we can have these smart card data over a long period. So these data from Shizuoka that we collected, we have now over 8 years. And so we can see how people have adjusted during different life stages. Again, especially for aging, this is very interesting to see how aged people with progressing age, especially if they enter their 80s, how they start reducing public transport. Who does it? What is the relation to their previous mobility patterns? Okay. So just to give you here some examples of how these smart card data can be useful for quite a range of applications. Another data that we use a lot is bus GPS data, and here we can look at the variability of the services. And so where does bus bunching occur during over the course of a line? So these are the regular records of the buses with which we can observe their position, and from that we can even infer some of the demand by looking at the dwell time of the buses at the different stops. That's about public transport, but I want to be a bit more general here. And so, of course, I mentioned Mars before, and one of the main Mars companies that you probably might have heard about is WIM, operating in Helsinki, operating in Birmingham, and you can see here again all the features. Because we have the big data, therefore we can predict demand. Therefore we can offer bundles of packages. So you can see here on this web page, this company offering a pay-as-you-go package, offering a package where you have to pay £100 per month, and you get unlimited public transport, and well, not that much more here. Or you get the unlimited pass, where you have also unlimited taxi in it. But again, only because we have big data, this system is possible. But then comes another interesting question, and is how does these data and the data and the change in the transport system, how does it in the end also affect the behavior? How do people adjust their behavior because of these packages? And well, I don't know how familiar or how well known this word WIM also is for you. For me, it wasn't a very common word, but I looked it up, and what does WIM actually mean? WIM means actually a sudden desire or change of mind, especially one that is unusual or unexplained. And I think with all our innovations in the transport system, this is one very important point, and this is feeding to my introduction idea of irregular trips. Because we have these possibilities, we can become much more flexibility. That is a good thing in some aspect, but it also raises a lot of challenges not least for the transport planner and maybe also for travelers. So just to show you one picture here, this is a famous noodle shop in Japan. And I wonder if there is something like, or if we will have also in the future more of these whim effects, as I might call them. What I mean is here, because we are so flexible, because if our transport system allows us unlimited travel, we have this mobility as a service packages where you just pay your monthly fee and then any trip you make is covered by this by this one down payment that you made. What does it mean? It actually probably means that people also will make additional trips, and maybe the additional trips to places that have been already popular anyway might become even more popular, together with social media, together with other big data that we have. Now the big data triggering transport innovations, triggering better transport, triggering this change in behaviors, and actually leading to a lot of dynamics and a lot of to possibly unsustainable dynamics as well. Okay, so this was this is one point I want to make you think about. Okay, if we talk about transport innovations and big data, and it's about all these new systems, but it's also about how people react to the information that we have. So there's like I would propose there's a three-step link. The transport triggering new data, but also vice versa, the new data triggering new transport, and then the transport triggering again changes in behavior, and especially making the behavior much more flexible and possibly creating much more congestion and creating these difficult to estimate dynamics, creating a lot more irregular trips. Okay, that's the first point I want to make. Now, in the second part of this talk, I want to now link this specifically to shared mobility. Okay, so shared mobility overview and HAMO research. If you think about sharing economy, which I'm sure is also will be very familiar with you. Well, I think in many aspects, of course, India is at the forefront of this, so I don't have to spend much time on this. But just to make again the point here is that this sharing economy in transport and in very different aspects means a better use of resources, again, enabled by this big data, enabled by these data platforms, because I can share what I'm using now, where I want to go, for which of my own belongings I need and I don't need. Therefore, I can offer them for other people to use at the same time. No, not at the same time. At the time when I don't need them, I can share my home. I can share my car. I can share my parking place. Just to give you one example here, that in Japan is parking places are often a problem. And then this is an app that where you can share your parking place once you are during the day when you're away. And I guess in a city like Kyoto, this is very, very popular because again, it's a tourism city. People who are working who live next to some of the tourist attractions. In that case, it's very you can make a small side business by renting out your parking place during the day. Because if we mostly think about shared transports, we think about these type of systems that are listed here. And I think it's important to distinguish here two aspects. One is ownership and utilization sharing, and the second one is ride sharing, and which is usually called which is also referred to as carpooling. Yeah? It's important to distinguish these two types. If we want to also think about, and that's the title of today's workshop, about sustainable transport, their pros and cons, how they influence the transport and how they influence the kilometers driven in city, we need to distinguish their different pros and cons. So let me briefly just go through this and then count our own research. And as one slide as a background here, if you think about Japan in the context of Japan, this is the number of people using car sharing in Japan, and you can see that the number is booming. But to be fair, this is only a very small part of the picture, because this car sharing is a lot of car rental organizations where people have become members. There's very little free-floating car sharing. There's very little of the dynamic car sharing that is popular in a lot of other cities, in a lot of around other parts of the world. So car sharing developments. Actually, it started in 1948 with one system called Seefahrt- and Selbstfahrgemeinschaft, or these kind of car clubs, where people wanted to start enjoy driving. Then the next step were car rental companies. Then the next thing was Zipcar. And this is advanced in Japan. Also, this is present, but especially it's present I should say, a focus here in Japan is on the idea of using small electric vehicle. You can see here a picture of Choi Mobi that is operating in Yokohama since 2017. But again, it's a round way car sharing, so you have to bring back your car to the place where you also borrowed it. The next thing then is one way car sharing, and I show here two pictures. One is from Germany, one is from Japan. In Germany, a big system that is used is the so-called Stadtauto, and so this. There's a bit of a wordplay. For those of you who know German, so Stadt but written with a D also means city. So it means city car sharing. But Stadt with TT means instead of. So instead of owning my own car, people use the car sharing companies. So the idea really is that, okay, that this one-way car sharing can help people to get rid of their own car and use therefore these car sharing types. In Japan, again, this is not that much present. The round-way car sharing, a bit more there. The one-way car sharing, there's two cases, and one is HAMO. This is the system that I will talk about in a minute. HAMO stands for Harmonious Mobility, and this is a scheme operated by or from Toyota. Actually, I should maybe mention Choi Mobi is organized by Nissan, HAMO is organized by Toyota, and these are again small 1- or 2-seater electric vehicles. Then there is free-floating car sharing, and I think probably most of you heard about Cars Go or Drive Now. If you have shared, they've merged now to Share Now. There's of course a lot of other systems, Green Wheels, and the main point is it requires on-street parking, and this idea that you can drive everywhere, that you can park your car everywhere. And then of course the same thing we have for bicycle sharing, station-based, again, round type.
Hydroelectric power plant was planned. So lots of positive impact.
Okay. State and free-floating bicycle sharing. Yes. There's also, of course, my car sharing, so that I share my own car, and peer-to-peer car rentals, and so that I share my own car with other persons. Famous system here to get around in the US. Then there's e-scooter sharing. The legislation here going on, and of course again we have here free floating as well as station-based sharing, and in many places this is thought to be very much a solution to the last mile problem, but I guess the verdict is still out there if it really is. Other ride-sharing examples, so this is now the second type, so ride-sharing examples. Well, I think this has traditionally happened a lot without much big data. This happened a lot informally. When I was a student in Germany, you would have a pinboard in the university and ask for people to, if I can share a long distance ride. Now these pinboards are replaced by information and by a lot of apps that we can use. In Japan also, but in Japan again, this is very limited presence. And there is the so-called not-code system with the idea that we can share rides again for long distance. Let's ride together is the main message here. So, what are the general impacts of these different sharing systems, car sharing as well as ride sharing systems? Of course, on the positive, we have less cars. But for a country like Japan that is heavily based on the car industry, of course, there's also this negative impact on, well, actually, or the worry that maybe the cars being sold actually reduces. So there is a strong question, to be honest, if this is really the case. I still doubt that many people actually start to get rid of their car because of the possibility to use car sharing. More kilometers per car, so cars will be more used, but that leads, of course, to a very nice advantage in that it leads to a newer fleet size. There is less parking. That's in some sense because the cars are more used, so there is less parking. That's a good thing. So again, if we think about it, especially in Japan, where we have a lot of car parking companies, I think some of them will also have to change their business quite a lot. Another important point is better sized cars. So because of this utilization sharing, I can usually get a much better fitted size car to what I need. I don't need to, and this is where I put some of my hope, is that I think people start realizing they don't need to buy that big car anymore, because for those few times in the year where you really need a big car, then you can rent a car. Think about ride sharing impact, yeah? So I really want to distinguish these two again, utilization sharing and ride sharing. Here we have less occupied trips. That's on the positive. But on the other side, if you think about these detours that people make and possibly empty trips, especially in countries where maybe the value of time of people is not so high, and so actually these negative effects can be quite significant. Further impact of both sharing types is public transport trips and walking lead to more shared car trips. So do we reduce the active trips by car trips? That can be a big problem. Or do we have, is the positive side more stronger presence? That actually we can get rid of car trips because these last car trips solve the car mileage problem, and therefore the car trips are replaced by public transport trips but shared trips. So which one is stronger? And it's very highly context specific. I think US evidence usually suggests that the positive effect outweighs the negative effects, but especially in a country like Japan, I'm not sure about, and I would be very curious what the situation of this is in India, which one is stronger. And also we have additional trips due to less cost per kilometer. Less cost per kilometer clearly is advantageous, and we make transport better, we make transport more accessible. But on the other side, again, this cause of less transport costs, transport is always a question of supply and demand. If we have less transport costs, we also create additional trips. So again, which effect do we weigh stronger? The accessibility gain or the increased transport due to the accessibility gain? Again, these are difficult questions, and I think how a transport planner answers these questions is context specific and is policy specific. Resulting research questions of this is, and I'm now slowly, so for those of you for whom this has been too general, I'm now coming towards more specific of our research outputs. The resulting research questions, therefore, are clearly, one is, we want to quantify this, and we want to understand with these new transport modes, in particular shared transport, but also the other new transport schemes like MaaS, like autonomous vehicles, are the positive or the negative effects stronger? Which will outweigh the other? Which one will outweigh which? And then, if we can do so, how to steer these? Yeah, so that we are, as a transport planner, yeah, I want to make suggestions in terms of what transport demand management measures do I need? Is there really a need for road pricing? How can I design my public transport network better now, since I do have the feasibility of sharing platforms, of mobility as a service, and so on. And then on an individual question, of course, is and who will adapt and when? And especially if we think about populations that are very heterogeneous, with for example, a rich and a poor population, whom do we actually help by the transport system, and for whom do we actually cause additional problems because of, for example, the additional trips that we have created? So those are some of the questions that we tried to answer with HARMO data. The data. Initially, we had data in 2006 for 3 years. That was the first phase of analysis. We then extended that with newer data. So, I should have probably updated here the date, since we do also use newer data. So so just to give you a bit more detail here, HARMO. So what does it cost? Yeah, so there is one-person vehicle. There's two-person vehicles, and the price here, it's not that cheap. It's something like so 100 yen is about $1, a US dollar roughly, and so this is what you pay for these cars. So they're not cheap, but if you need them and if they are convenient, then they're competitive to other transport options. In Japan, they're operating in 2 cities, in Toyota and in Tokyo. Toyota City, that is, that's a city not far from Nagoya. And in Tokyo, the system only operates in one specific part of Tokyo, and there are around in both cities around 60 stations. So once more, this is a one-way car sharing system, so you can pick the car up at some point and drop it off at any other point. So we analyzed the development of demand patterns in terms of frequency, time, and spatial distribution. And if we look at differences between Tokyo, so the main metropolitan area in Japan, and Toyota, we do find quite a number of, I think, interesting differences. So, for example, in Tokyo has a much higher spatial dispersion. So what we mean with that is, people use the car sharing between to travel between more stations. In Toyota, a city which is a smaller city, where you have one central station, and where you have a few, for example, Toyota Motor Factory, there's a few dominant places where car sharing is used, and so that means that the whole system can be designed quite differently, and you might actually reduce the number of stations in order to keep the system profitable. Whereas in Tokyo, that's more difficult because of the larger spatial dispersion. The first point I mentioned on this slide is that the number of infrequent users is rapidly increasing, and the number of high-frequency users lost. And this has been a real problem. That actually there's a lot of people who occasionally use the system, but very few users who use the system on a highly regular basis, and that makes it again difficult for demand prediction. And again, therefore, there's again this cyclic effect with the data. Okay, this slide I want to I want to really explain, and this is I think one of the interesting results we have here. So what we did plot here, what you see here is on the x-axis is kilometer, and on the y-axis here you see time. And we took survey data. Every 5 years there's a big survey done in Tokyo. So yeah, I should mention these are data from Tokyo. And so we took the survey data and extracted from this survey data the public transport data. And you can see these dots in the background is the average distance and time that people need on public transport for different trips in the Tokyo area. So, for example, this trip, for this origin-destination relationship, the origin destination have a distance of around 5 kilometers, and people required 10 minutes for this trip on public transport. Yeah. So that's a very good public transport connection. Yeah. Whereas this one, there is the public transport system is not serving this origin destination well at all. Yeah. So it's only a trip of around not even 2 kilometers, but the travel time is almost an hour, yeah? 55 minutes. So in general, in blue you can see here these are trips not served well by public transport, and in yellow you can see trips that are very well served by public transport. So, or I might talk about areas of the network. Yeah. So, for example, you can think about yellow dots here. These are points where you don't have to change, and there is a very good train connection that brings you from A to B very fast. Yeah? Whereas the blue points, you need to maybe change 2 or 3 times by public transport before you get to your destination. Okay, so those are the blue, green, and yellow dots. Yeah, so these lines here are just introduced to separate these fast, medium speedy, and these slow public. Sorry, other way around. Fast public transport trips, medium and slow public transport trips. And now we took here on the highlighted red dots. Those OD relations for which, so origin destination relationships, for which we have a lot of car sharing trips. So we observe a lot of car sharing trips on those origin destination relationships. So therefore what we would hope for is that these red dots are on this side, right? If these red dots are on this side, it means that people use car sharing in case public transport is bad. Yeah? Once more, if these red dots would be in this area, it means that people use car sharing in case public transport is bad. This is what we want. But you can see here we see fairly little evidence for that. If anything, we can see that these dots tend to those where the public transport is fast. Yeah. So I should say there's of course some bias in here, in that of course that relations where you have fast public transport trips, there will also be in general more trips. Well, but actually, no, it's not a bias because for the car sharing, of course, this relation doesn't hold. So we would would still expect that then the car sharing we would if people would use car sharing as a replacement of public transport, again, we would expect these dots to be more here, but we can't see that much. And I think this shows that in at least for our case study, car sharing is not really used as a public transport replacement. Sorry, not as a public transport substitute. Yes, so as a substitute when public transport is bad. So what do we learn from that? Well, I mean, this I think raises some questions as to is public, so an often phrased hypothesis, yeah, that as I mentioned in some of the previous slides, is that if you look here, yeah, that we want the green effect instead of the red effect, yeah? That we don't want public transport trips be replaced by shared car trips, but only those trips where public transport is bad. But we don't find much evidence for the good effect that we would hope for. And so coming to the topic of this conference, of this conference, yeah, so we have to again very carefully think, where is car sharing as well as right sourcing, where is it useful and where is it actually replacing public transport trips, and where is it actually helping those with limited mobility. Okay. A number of other studies we did, well, and sometimes related to this, but this is a study now related to this was on Tokyo, this is on Toyota. We can see here that we studied here the effect of car sharing stations on the accessibility in the network. Accessibility here measured as the average travel time that people require from a place in the network to other popular places in the network. And where do you now put this shared mobility? Where do you put these stations? You need a mix. You need a mix. So one car sharing station has to be at the main public transport hub, and then a number of other car sharing stations should be in places where you have very limited public transport. So again, this is a smaller size city. This is Toyota City, where the public transport is fairly limited, and here you can see here the one of a good layout of car sharing stations here is to put quite a number in places where there is fairly little public transport, and then a few to put them at the public transport hubs, so that people can use car sharing in combination with public transport for the longer distance trips. Okay. So we analyze that, and then here you can what we plot here is an accessibility index. So again, in terms of here measured as the time that people need from a place to another. And what you can see here is basically we plotted here the increase in accessibility from a case where we don't have car sharing to a case where we have car sharing. Anyway, you can see here where the lighter the color, the better the accessibility after we introduce car sharing. Related to that, of course, we can ask how many car sharing stations we need. And here, what we did here was we just employed some heuristics to find out. And you can see here that we found that probably around here, in this case, around 20 to 25 to 50 car sharing stations. That gives us a good number for the city. But if we have more, the accessibility increase actually is very little. And if we trade that off with costs for providing car sharing, then there is a probably around 25 to 50 seems to be a good number. Those were descriptive studies with car sharing. The next aspect was now the to look at, to actually try to model and to predict demand. And I want to show you this slide here, where we said, okay, we have those trip records, and these records, these big data, which are not that big, they provide us information about how often people travel by car sharing, the temporal distribution, spatial distribution, travel distance, travel time. And of course, that is a result of individual travel behavior, which is triggered by people being willing to use car sharing, as well as the potential demand they have. In other words, if I don't have a demand, if I'm very happy with my with me using car or public transport, well, then I will not swap. Then any kind of new transport system, new transport innovation will not trigger much change. So we have to go here backward from those trip records that we observe, and to understand the willingness and the potential demand, which will depend in turn on a number of other concepts such as perception, cost, service quality, information, individual factors, and needs. Okay, so we studied that, and we distinguished it here into two parts. Firstly, how many will use car sharing? When do they start car sharing? And secondly, after one has used after one has entered car sharing, and what is the dynamic then? Does one keep increasing car sharing over time? How long is one in the system? This leads us to this, what I call here, this lifetime modeling and Markov chains. The idea here being that, okay, like with any product, people start to become attached to car sharing, and over time you might use it more, but at some point you will also, for some reason, many users also stop using it again. So just to briefly show you, so firstly, for the first part, how many will enter and where, what we did was we used a so-called modified bus model. The bus model is a product diffusion model. And we say here that the amount of people using car sharing will, among others, depend on how many others already using the car sharing, as well as whether they have information, as well as, of course, how attractive the system is. And so we defined here this so-called modified bus model. There's a lot of technical details here, which I decided for this presentation I skipped, just to give you here some key results here of some of our models. What we can see here is we model the number of people entering the system, new adopters, we call it. And this is the time period since operation, and we can see here how the number of people actually starts increasing and starts having an early peak, and then reducing, and then we have a second peak here. And this we felt actually is quite meaningful, which is this two-peak system. For a lot of other products, this bus model, and for those of you in marketing, you'll be probably familiar with the bus model. So if I look at how other products, how new products are sold, we usually see this S-shaped curve. But in this case, in the transport case, we saw here a first wave of people entering the system, that probably people who are really needing this new transport option. You see immediately after the system is opening, a lot of new people entering the system. So this is what we might call the latent demand, those people who have been waiting for the system. Once this is fulfilled, and more people start using the system, this number goes down. But then there comes a point where, okay, in this case, this is months. There comes a second wave, and this second wave here, second wave at the moment, of course, has a bit of negative connotation. We talk about with COVID, we'll talk about unfortunate second waves. But here it's nothing of that. Here's the positive meaning in that we're saying that, okay, we find here actually that a number of people have started using the system, and therefore other people learn that this is a good system and also start using it, and therefore we get a second group of people also starting to adopt car sharing. We get this positive effect here. Okay, we fixed here different models with different sets of parameters. Again, this is probably a different talk, which I skip for now. Again, I want to mainly give you an overview. And then secondly, frequency dynamics after entering. Our idea here was mainly to say, okay, if people use car sharing, how does this develop over time? When do people drop out? And this was the study of a PhD student here in Kyoto, and he defined this really as a life cycle from a user being born to a user then being in the system and changing its frequency until in the end he starts dropping out. Yeah, sorry. No. Okay. And just to show you here one transition matrix. In this case, yeah, you can see here how people. These are usage frequencies from very low frequency to very high frequency. And we can see here that people, so for example, people who are in a very low frequency state keep a low frequency state with a probability of 61%, but with some probability they also start increasing. The problem with this matrix here is that we have more values on the lower diagonal than on the upper diagonal. And this means that over time, of course, the usage frequency is reducing. Yeah? So once more, higher values here mean more frequency, more often using the system. And then this has been happening with some of the car sharing systems that are introduced, and therefore, actually, the usage in some of these is in decline. Okay, that was the second part. I now have around another 10 minutes for the last part. I actually should have left more time with that. And demand estimation examples with big data. Okay. Here, I want to come back to this. Okay, you see here I illustrated here from the big data to car sharing and the change in demand and how people are adapting, and especially we wanted to look at how this is the case for tourists. Especially Kyoto is a tourist city. Kyoto is one of the most frequented tourist cities actually in the world until of course the Corona crisis happened, and these are data in 2000. A little bit outdated data, but it will be very interesting how tourist numbers develop after the Corona crisis is over. Kyoto being because of tourists highly crowded. So here you can see some of the pedestrian parts. Again, crowding is of course very familiar to many of you in India, but in Japan, especially to Kyoto as well, and especially also on public transport. And it starts to affect people's quality of life, leading to complaints as to actually the crowding leading to a reduced quality of life for many people, for many citizens. So therefore, we try to use these big data that I mentioned to actually estimate trips and estimate tours. Kyoto has quite a number of touristic areas, which are, you can see here, these 37 areas, this is too big to walk. And so people start visiting maybe this eastern area, or some people go to the western area, but then they have to use public transport in between. And therefore, we want to understand also the demand of people using public transport for the tourism trips. And again, here, most traditional data are good for estimating, this is the point I made in the beginning, commuting, leisure, and shopping trips. but not for such irregular trips. And also these big data such as
quality
data, they're again not very useful to really understand tourism trips. So we try to use here some of these other new forms of big data that we have. One is mobile phone data. Again, in Japan, we have here only aggregate mobile phone data. We don't, for privacy reasons, we don't have the single trip records. So therefore, to actually understand the behavior of individuals, we here needed to do quite a lot of pre-processing of this aggregate data to be able to understand trip patterns in the city. And well, this led to a lot of data cleaning work, where we actually found quite a lot of discrepancies in actually what the data say where people are, and where actually another data set which says how people are moving, and how this data differ, and causing quite a big problem for actually tour estimation of people. The second data that we used was these Wi-Fi data. These are Wi-Fi sensors, and then we're quite excited about this data. These are sensors that we installed in the city, and if you pass these sensors with your mobile phone or any other Wi-Fi enabled device, then your mobile phone will send out a search request. Even if you're already connected to a network, we just pick up this search request. And this gives us a MAC address. This doesn't give us any personal information. So it's much nicer than trying to collect data from via mobile phone apps and via tracking. And because these are, the only thing is what we knew is a MAC address, nothing else about the person. But we can use that to therefore then understand people's behavior in the city. So for example, this is the eastern part of Kyoto, and we could track how tourists now move between these 20 sensors that we installed, and we can learn from that the typical travel patterns of people inside the city. So one thing we did was clustering in here, a cluster analysis, and so we can, for example, distinguish users that walk fast and use shortest paths without visiting points of interest. Typical routes of those using walking slower and taking detours to visit specific points of interest. Others that try to cover most sites in a very short time, as well as staff, and as well as, for example, residents that we can distinguish. But then secondly, well, that understanding what type of people we have is only one thing, but we also wonder and understand, okay, what routes do people actually take? And can we predict the impact of, for example, shops, and can we predict the impact of points of interest on where people walk? And for that is what we defined here is something called a recursive logic model, and where we model the decision of a person to choose a next link depending on the utility of that link, as well as on the on how much closer it brings you to a potential destination that you have as a tourist. Again, I don't have so much time here now, but I just want to point out, yes, so we created this network, looking at the walking environment, looking at the different points of interest that we have, from souvenir shops to restaurants to the main sites. At the bottom here you can see Kiyomizu Temple, one of the main tourist attractions, World Heritage Site in the area, and we put these as into our model as points of interest, and with that we developed this recursive logic model. This is one of the key results that we get here, and with this is we can now estimate, for example, the effect of a food shop or a souvenir shop on people staying on a specific link. We introduced here what we call stay links and move links. And so with these numbers, or for example here, a sightseeing spot. So with these numbers now, now we're in a position to say, okay, if we introduce number of shops, if we change the layout of where we allow people to walk for sightseeing, we could then start to predict changes in flow of pedestrians. We're conducting an extended study now on the whole city of Kyoto with more sensors. And the final data, okay, I think I skipped this, but it's journey plan accuracies and tracking data, where this is where people this is again where people have to opt in to say, okay, I allow myself to be tracked, and in that case, for example, we can track the route of some of the people, and then we can try to combine that with the other data that we have to get a better picture of overall tourist route in the city. So I skipped that, and with that, I want to come to I've maybe tried to cover too much, but I want to give you some of my main takeaway points, that if you feel that some things were not in detail enough, then I hope you can you take these points away. Firstly, big data is trigger for transport innovations. And because we have the big data, because we have this data, we change the transport. New transport systems are developed. Also the other way around, but I think this way is very important. Secondly, shared mobility in its various form as one prime example of this effect that big data trigger new transport innovations. And I pointed out the different forms of shared transport, and that I think they have to be, the different forms of shared transport have to be distinguished, and we require quite a careful context-specific discussion on whether there are positive or negative environmental impacts. Shared mobility, to be honest, in Japan, I don't see so far much positive impacts in terms of, if we think about if we talk about again sustainable transport. For some people, there is, of course, it has increased their accessibility, but on an overall scale, there's still a lot of discussion ongoing. Secondly, big data offer not only new analysis possibilities, but are one reason for changes in travel patterns through the impact on service improvements. I mentioned the whim effect, what I call the whim effect. Because of more flexibility, I would argue that actually the transport system, because it's becoming, the accessibility is increasing, because we have maybe these unlimited transport options, therefore the point of interest itself and their quality become more important. So if you have if you offer a good service, if your product is better, you probably gain from smart mobility solutions. But on the other side, also service or point of interest, or shops or restaurants that don't offer such a good service, they will probably also suffer more from better transport options. And then irregular trips are also a challenge for big data. And then for this last point, this irregular trips as a challenge for big data. In the last part of my talk, I showed you this example of tourist trips in Kyoto, where we have a very strong, rapid growth, where a lot of irregular trips. Again, tourists are a very heterogeneous group. To understand how tourists are traveling is very difficult to predict. And there are fast changing patterns. There we have a lot of shops, a lot of maybe exhibitions, if you think about museums, if you think about special events. So these tourism trips are very highly dynamic. And for that, we need data to understand it, but also the data influencing those patterns at the same time. There's a number of data sources. I mostly skip this, but mobile phone data, where unless you have individual data, require a lot of thinking, of transferring the aggregate data back to individual data. Wi-Fi data that provide detailed data on flows between specific points. So, and I think quite attractive for many points. So this is at the moment really one of our key research topics. And then journey planner applications that are very useful, but of course we have strong biases in that we only capture a specific group of users to do that. Good. So once more, I show this last slide as a kind of food of thought of potential effects that we have from a lot of transport options. And I want to thank you for your attention, showing you here one picture of Kyoto here in autumn. And then, well, finally, I should mention that this presentation draws on a range of collaborative work, and in particular the dissertations of 4 of my students, Jantan working on car sharing, Yuan Gao on Wi-Fi data, Tanishigaki also on car sharing, specifically the accessibility aspects, and Mr. Kawakami, who works on mobile phone data. And there are others I should also mention, but these were the students I mostly draw on this. Okay, I close with that, and I'm of course very open to questions. And again, I hope I found a bit of compromise and something that interests you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sensei, for such a nice information. Now, I will request to all participants to please write down your queries in chat box. I think, yeah, people are writing. So, Sensei, you can see in the chat box. You can remove this presentation and come to the chat box. So there are many questions waiting for your reply.
Yeah. Okay.
So, can you see chat box, Sensei?
Yes, I can see the chat box. Yes.
Okay. So you can go just to the last query. Okay. With that, you can see when you will move upward a little bit. There is a question at 4:49 p.m. by Shikhar. He is asking about some thought on the shared transport system in terms of India. If you have any idea, using the big data technology and smart transport system.
But I couldn't hear you well.
Do you have any transport system of India? Did you find something?
You mean I see here the question? You mean the last one? No, for
just go a little bit up at 4:49 p.m.
4:49. Okay.
Asked by Shikhar.
No, 4:49. I have already no.
Okay, I will copy paste again. You can see in the last. Okay, Sanjay?
Okay.
Yeah, I paste it again in the last. You can see there.
Okay, can you give some thought on the shared transport? Okay, now I see it. Give some thought on the shared transport system in terms of India, if you have some ideas, and also the ways to include big data technology in smart transport system. Well,
scenario of India.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult for me to answer. I should be frank here. I mean, I'm not an expert on India. I think you have a lot of right sourcing already in India, right? The Uber-like companies, the right sourcing companies, I think are also, of course, already very successful in India. And I think, of course, I mean, okay, this is a thought I do have. Of course, with India being such a advanced country in many technological aspects, and in terms of, for example, the spread of mobile phone technology, of course, those data, of course, India can jump many of the development steps that we had in transport systems in developed countries. Yeah? So I think these questions are especially relevant for India to think about. Okay, public transport maybe not that good. Can we immediately jump to a good shared transport system? But on the other side, I think that the point that I tried to make in the presentation here, I think are still also very relevant in an Indian context. The point is to say that would shared transport actually help or actually damage public transport? I think, and especially in some of the more rural parts of India, maybe actually you help. It could lead to a case where the mainstream public transport might not be feasible anymore. You don't have enough demand. You take away some of the trips, and therefore actually mainstream public transport starting to struggle. Of course, a lot of shared transport will say, well, they're supporting public transport. Maybe that's true, but I think it has to be very carefully analyzed.
Yeah. Okay. Sensei, one more question I have pasted in the text box. So by one participant, Prayas. So he asked, what are the backward analysis software in Indian context?
I'm not sure I fully understand this question. Yeah, I mentioned backward analysis as a case from. So in my case, it was for I mentioned the context of the mobile phone data. The problem for us was that we get aggregate data. There are, of course, individual data, but we can't get them for privacy reasons. And sometimes that's good. But we're trying to do backward analysis in the sense that, okay, we try to replicate the individual information from the aggregate information. So we're trying to reestablish something that's already there from the aggregate data. I don't think there is a specific software to do so. I mean, I think this is really, in our case, we really had to think very carefully, okay, what restrictions do these data have? For example, in our case, there was a strong limitation in the sense that a lot of trips were omitted because they were short trips and the data were aggregated over a longer time period. And it depends on the specific data format that will answer which shortcomings are most important and for which this backward analysis is mostly required. So this is unfortunately difficult to answer generally. So yes.
Yeah. That's another question. I think this is really interesting. You will like it.
Yeah.
The next, I pasted in the chat box.
Okay. How and what way car design and the usage, the car sharing, carpooling will be affected due to new situation in view of COVID-19? Yeah. How and what way car design and the using the sharing, carpooling will be affected due to new situation in view of COVID-19?
Actually, the participant is asking the impact of COVID on car sharing. Simply, I can say.
Yes. 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 I mean, of course, at the moment, there's firstly the question of carpooling, right? So riding together, and that I think is, of course, currently, well, it has reduced a lot, and even ride sourcing, there's a lot more hygiene restrictions now. and I think in some parts it's even banned currently with now the crisis
Yes.
being very present. I mean, it will come back, but yes, it will. I think it will suffer and it will slow it down. I don't think it will. I'm not sure how long a lasting effect it has. If we think about, okay, I think one thing it might do is it will make it more expensive, because you need to have much more hygiene cleaning in between different customers. And especially for car sharing, if a car operator is required now because of COVID-19 to clean the car every time between two customers using the car, it will incur an additional cost, and that will be passed on to the customer, right? So I think my short answer is that it will make it more expensive. So
Yes, that is true, because it is going to affect. That is true. So
it
next
will make it
question.
more expensive, and yeah.
There's another question by Bridge
Again,
Kishore.
it might also be if we think again if we think about it as a competitor of public transport, I mean, public transport is suffering more from COVID-19.
Yeah.
And I think people might be more willing to do car sharing with just one other driver or with just one or two other person in the car than using a full bus. So in that sense, it might actually end up gaining from this crisis, at least more than public transport.
So one more question is there, the chat box. You can see in the bottom. So the question is, self-driving cars will systematically work on rural areas. So
Yes.
I really doubt on this. If they will really work good in an effective way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. This in Japan, there is self-driving cars are currently firstly tested in rural areas.
Oh wow!
These are very slow autonomous vehicles.
Wow.
There's especially Toyota and the Nagoya University promoting this context of slow autonomous vehicles. And the idea is that these autonomous vehicles can be very supportive for older people in rural areas. This is where they will be firstly introduced. And so my answer here would really be, I think they're safe if they're moving slow. I don't want to have a racing self-driving car. But so these are the cars that they are using is the same as the Hamo vehicles that I showed. This one person electric vehicles, and they're driving with something 20-30 kilometers in some rural parts there, and they're starting to take older people who don't feel confident driving by themselves anymore, and where there is very little public transport for them to take as an alternative. So in those contexts, these autonomous vehicles are extremely useful, and also they are I think they're fairly safe there. Yeah. So, well, at least they much more safer than in cities where we have high density and so many interacting transport participants.
Okay, Sensei, one more question is there.
Yeah.
Like through smart transport system, can we reduce major accidents on road, and how?
Yeah, I mean, of course, okay, kind of feeding on from the previous question. I mean, I mentioned the pros and cons of autonomous vehicles to some degree, in that yeah, they will probably create more trips, and with more trips, we might also have some more accidents. But of course, the main advantage of autonomous vehicles is that, for example, you reduce some common accidents. You will reduce. I'm thinking particularly about drink driving, right? So drink driving still accounts for a huge proportion of accidents. And with self-driving cars, you don't have drink driving accidents anymore. Yeah, you will have some accidents where, well, like those famous Tesla accidents or other accidents. But a whole lot of accidents will just be eliminated because of automation. Then I think if we think about public transport, yes, is smart public transport also safer? Yeah, I guess at least people feel safer with being always informed where my vehicle is. People feel safer. People feel better. And of course, also the bus might actually be. If I have the GPS records, if I can. Through the GPS records, if I therefore can managing my bus system so that the buses become regular, that might indirectly also have a benefit on accidents, in that the regular bus system will mean that the drivers also don't have to speed up anymore to catch up with the schedule, for example, and also that there is less stress in the system for huge customer crowding because the bus is delayed and so on. So I think indirectly, if my service is better, if the service quality is better in terms of being regular, in terms of being on time, in terms of customer being more satisfied, this is likely to also have an impact on less accidents occurring. So in that sense, okay, my answer has been twofold. So one is some categories of accidents we immediately eliminate because of technology, and in terms of, and my second answer is that good public transport will also lead to a higher reliable transport, which indirectly also leads to less accidents.
Okay. So, is there any other query from participant? So you can ask question. So since they are asking your research area in urban transportation.
Yes. And so now, and I see a number of people asking here for feedback links.
No, we will provide the feedback link to them.
Okay.
And related to, but they are asking about your research area in urban transportation. So, what is
Okay.
your research area?
I hope I covered quite a bit in this presentation, I think, right? So I mean, it's mostly focused on public transport, but this. So at the moment, it's really understanding travel patterns through these new big data sources, Wi-Fi data, smart card data. So estimating travel patterns from these data sources that I would describe at the moment as my main research topic.
Okay. So any other query from the participant? I think no query is there. So thank you, Sensei, for giving and such an informative session. It was really enthusiastic, and we have learned really new method technology implemented in developed country. So it may help us even in India to research on that, to work on that, such technology data which are available by the different organization or departments as well as the mobile companies. We can collect data and we can work on that. So now I will request to our co-coordinator, Dr. Pooja Gupta, to give vote of thanks. Sir.
Thank you, sir. It's really grateful to thank Dr. Schumacher on behalf of Poornima Institute of Engineering and Technology and Civil Engineering Department. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us with your informative speech. Also, I would like to thank Director Poornima Group for support and guidance. My sincere thanks to Dr. Dinesh Goyal, who Principal and Director, Poornima Institute of Engineering and Technology, for motivating us to conduct this webinar. Thanks to Dr. Pranath Dadi, Head of the Civil Engineering Department, and all faculty and staff members for their continued support. Heartiest thanks to all the participants for joining us. Thank you all. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you, Sensei. If you want to say some few words to for our participants.
Yeah, well, thank you all for listening. And well, if you have more questions, so yes, so my email was also in the slide there. And well, yeah, thank you also, yeah, also for the not just for listening, also for the questions, also interesting for me. And yeah, I hope so that this, okay, I mean, again, I gave him this talk at a few points. I went a bit deeper, but my main idea was to give you an overview of these different data possibilities and their connection to different forms of smart transport. And I think with India having such a rich space and different rich data from different aspects, I think there is a lot of possibilities, especially there. And I think many of you might use that for might be interested in pursuing that in your own research.
Okay, Sensei.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sensei. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm thankful to
Hello.
you. Thank you, Sensei. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye for India.
Thank you.
Bye, yeah, bye from Japan.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello. Is there anyone?